A Hamilton doctor is calling on the federal government to do more to help those suffering in Sudan. His elderly mother is stuck in the East African country, unable to get home to Hamilton due to violent clashes between the government and a rival paramilitary group. Matt Ingram is following the developments in Sudan and joined us now with more. Matt.
Taz, the Prime Minister is thanking the government in neighbouring Djibouti for helping with Canadian evacuation efforts, and the Foreign Affairs Minister is in Kenya urging regional players to do more to help Sudan stop the fighting. The government says more than 400 Canadians have been able to get out of the country, but there's another 230 who have asked for help who are still stuck inside, including the mother of Dr. Abdelnasir Bashir, who's frustrated with Ottawa's efforts.
Are the lives of Africans less valuable than Europeans?
Comparing Canadian aid for Ukraine to what he wants the federal government to do for Sudan, Dr. Abdelnasir Bashir says his requests aren't very large.
We're not asking for tanks or fighter jets like Ukraine.
He wants his 81-year-old Canadian mother, Mahasan Ismail, brought home and emergency visas issued to his 3 Sudanese siblings, as well as other Sudanese refugees with family in Canada and Sudanese women and children who have lost their husbands and fathers.
They are terrified. They are terrified.
Mahasan was visiting her grandkids in Madani when the war broke out, and due to the fighting was unable to get to Canadian evacuation flights in Khartoum. The deteriorating conditions on the ground have forced Canada to relocate evacuation efforts to Port Sudan, which is even further from Madani.
And I have a big problem, is that my mother does not want to leave without my 2 brothers and sisters.
Bashir is also requesting the Prime Minister intervene personally by asking the leaders of the 2 warring sides to stop the fighting and by freezing their foreign assets. He also wants Justin Trudeau to ask regional players like Egypt to refrain from taking sides, and is hoping the Prime Minister will also provide more humanitarian aid.
A conflict that is turning Sudan humanitarian crisis into a full-blown catastrophe.
Earlier today, the United Nations warned that more than 800,000 people may flee the fighting and warned the impact of that mass movement may create dire circumstances in neighboring nations. The top UN official in Sudan says the Sudanese army and the rival paramilitary group have agreed to send representatives for negotiations, even as clashes continue in Khartoum despite the extension of a ceasefire. The complex situation much simpler in the eyes of Bashir's 8-year-old son Alex, who just wants his grandma back.
She's really nice. She would give me chocolate.
Bashir's mother isn't the only Hamiltonian trapped. Last week, we told you about Nawal and Abdulazim Al-Azariq. Their daughter says they are staying in Madani, where they feel safe, unable to reach Canadian evacuation efforts in Port Sudan. And we also told you about Baha El-Sheikh's 80-year-old mother and extended family. He says they made it across the border and arrived in Cairo, Egypt this morning, but his 17-year-old Canadian nephew was unable to cross because of an expired passport. El-Sheikh is hopeful that he can help his nephew connect with Canadian authorities and hopefully eventually get him out of the war zone.